Meet Charles I, a man who firmly believed he was God's chosen manager for the entire Kingdom of England, a concept quaintly known as the divine right of kings. This is basically the ultimate "I'm the main character" syndrome backed up by theology. It's a great gig if you can get it. The problem is, Parliament, the group of people with all the money, had started to develop this tedious habit of wanting a say in how the country was run. Charles needed cash for his foreign policy adventures, which were going splendidly, if splendidly means expensive and pointless. When Parliament said no, he just dissolved them. He did this 3 times. Then he started levying taxes like ship money on inland towns, which is like charging desert communities for lighthouse maintenance. Add to that a very Catholic, very French Queen, Henrietta Maria, at a time when being Catholic in England was deeply unfashionable, and you have a recipe for a political migraine. Having successfully annoyed England, Charles, a master of efficiency, decided to annoy Scotland too. His big idea was to enforce a new, very English-style prayer book on the fiercely Presbyterian Scots. This was the 17th century equivalent of forcing a software update on a country that really liked its old operating system. The rollout went poorly. On July 23, 1637, at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, a woman traditionally identified as Jenny Geddes reportedly threw her stool at the dean, shouting something along the lines of, "You're not saying Mass in my ear!" This single act of customer dissatisfaction sparked nationwide riots. The Scots signed a national covenant, pledging to defend their religion, and raised an army. Charles, lacking funds because he'd boosted Parliament for 11 years, was forced to recall them to ask for money to fight the Scots he'd just enraged. Genius! Parliament, unsurprisingly, had a few notes. Instead of giving Charles money, they presented him with a long list of grievances. Charles, not a fan of constructive feedback, responded by marching into the House of Commons with 400 soldiers on January 4, 1642. He intended to personally arrest 5 of his loudest critics. This was a catastrophic breach of protocol. No monarch had ever entered the Commons chamber. It was also a spectacular failure. The men had already been tipped off and fled. The king looked around, asked the speaker if the birds had flown, and left with absolutely nothing but egg on his face. London erupted in protest. Charles fled the city. The time for awkward political maneuvering was over. Now it was time for the even more awkward business of civil war, pitting the flashy, long-haired royalist cavaliers against the sober, bowl-cut parliamentarian Roundheads. For the first few years, the war was a messy, aristocratic affair. Then a gentleman farmer named Oliver Cromwell came along and ruined everything for the king. Cromwell helped create the new model army. This was different. It wasn't an army of aristocrats leading peasants. It was a professional, meritocratic fighting force where you could get promoted for being good at your job. What a concept! More importantly, it was a deeply ideological Puritan army. They believed God was on their side, which is a terrifying force multiplier. These soldiers sang psalms as they marched into battle and saw every victory as a sign of divine providence. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and utterly convinced of their own righteousness. They were fighting a king they believed had betrayed God and country, while the king's army was fighting for, well, the king. One of these motivations turned out to be significantly more powerful. The new model army promptly wiped the floor with the royalists. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Naseby in 1645. The parliamentarians even captured the king's private baggage train, which contained letters proving he was trying to bring Irish, Catholic, and foreign troops into England. A PR disaster. Charles, now a fugitive, surrendered to the Scots, who promptly sold him to Parliament for 400,000. It's always awkward when your allies come with a price tag. And yet, even as a prisoner, Charles simply could not stop plotting. He saw himself as the only piece on the board that mattered, trying to play Parliament against the army and the English against the Scots. He was the guy who, having been checkmated, tries to convince you that your queen was secretly on his side all along. It didn't work. It just convinced everyone he could never be trusted. So Parliament had a king in a box. The problem was nobody had the instructions for what to do next. Most MPs didn't want to get rid of the monarchy, they just wanted a king who would play by their rules. But Charles, from his comfortable prison on the Isle of Wight, managed to kick off the Second Civil War in 1648. This was the final straw for the army. They had defeated him once, and his scheming had just caused more bloodshed. At a prayer meeting in Windsor, the army leaders came to a chilling conclusion. Charles Stuart was a man of blood, whom God demanded they bring to justice. This shifted everything. It was no longer a political negotiation. For Cromwell and the army hardliners, it had become a divine mission. Parliament, however, was still trying to cut a deal. The army, having done all the actual fighting, was not amused by this lack of commitment. The army's solution to political gridlock was beautifully direct. On December 6, 1648, a Colonel Thomas Pride stood at the door to the House of Commons with a list. This event, known with a certain flair as Pride's Purge, was effectively a military coup. As MPs arrived, Pride and his soldiers arrested or barred entry to anyone who was still in favor of negotiating with the king. About 180 MPs were kicked out. The remaining group of around 50 or 60 radicals became known as the Rump Parliament. It's crucial to remember this. The body that would go on to try and execute the king was not a representative government. It was the leftover rump, a small, military-backed faction that had seized power because they were the only ones willing to do the unthinkable. Democracy is great until it gets in the way of your divinely ordained mission to prosecute a monarch. The stage was now set for the most surreal show trial in English history. A High Court of Justice was created specifically for this purpose. When Charles was brought before it, he refused to enter a plea. His entire defense was to deny the court's legitimacy. He asked, "I would know by what power I am called hither, by what authority I mean lawful." It was a good question. The answer was, essentially, by the authority of the guys with all the swords. The prosecutor, John Cook, laid out the charge: tyranny, treason, and being an enemy of the people. The whole thing was legally inventive. Treason was historically an act against the king. How could the king commit treason against himself? It didn't matter. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The court's president, John Bradshaw, was so worried about assassination, he reportedly wore a steel-lined hat. After weeks of legal theater, 59 commissioners signed the death warrant, forever marking themselves as the Regicides. On January 30th, 1649, Charles Stuart was led to a scaffold built outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The details of the day are grimly fascinating. It was a bitterly cold day, and Charles famously requested to wear 2 shirts. He didn't want the crowd to see him shiver and mistake it for fear. He gave a short speech, declaring his innocence and his devotion to the people of England, though his voice was likely lost to the wind. The execution block was unusually low, meaning he would have to lie down almost prostrate, making it impossible to resist. He said a prayer, gave the signal, and a single, clean blow from the executioner's axe severed his head from his body. A witness reported that a groan, as I never heard before and desire I may never hear again, went up from the massive crowd. They had just watched the state methodically, legally, and soberly kill God's anointed king. Nobody knew what came next. With the king dead, England became a republic called the Commonwealth. They abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords. Freedom! Except not really. The next 11 years were a deeply awkward experiment in trying to run a country without the one thing its entire political structure had been based on for 1,000 years. It was messy, unstable, and deeply unpopular with most of the population who hadn't asked for any of this. Eventually, the Rump Parliament became so ineffective that Cromwell, in 1653, marched in with soldiers and dissolved it himself, famously saying, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go!" He was eventually made Lord Protector, which was basically a non-hereditary king with a much less catchy title. They had killed a king for being a tyrant, only to end up with a military dictator who was, in many ways, more powerful and autocratic than Charles had ever been. The irony was presumably lost on them. After Cromwell died, the whole Republican project fell apart. His son Richard, a far less formidable figure, couldn't hold it together. People were tired of military rule and puritanical laws that, among other things, banned Christmas celebrations. In 1660, England decided the whole no king thing was a terrible idea and invited Charles's exiled son back to take the throne. The restoration of King Charles II was a massive national party, but there was unfinished business. The new king had a list of the 59 men who signed his father's death warrant. The Regicide hunt was on. Those captured were subjected to a gruesome public death, hanging, drawing, and quartering. For the ones who were already dead, like Oliver Cromwell, the authorities didn't let a minor inconvenience like decomposition stop them. They dug up Cromwell's body, put it on trial, executed it, and stuck his head on a spike above Westminster Hall, where it remained for over 20 years. A deeply unsubtle reminder that when you kill a king, you'd better be sure his son doesn't come back. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!